Welcome to another special edition of Daily Airline News, focusing on the tragic loss of Air India Flight 171. I'm Jeffrey Thomas and delighted to say, joined by my co-host, Richard Godfrey in Frankfurt. Good afternoon, Richard.
And good evening, Jeffrey.
Yes, it is evening. It's 9:15 at night, so it's definitely evening. Today we're going to look at more viewer comments and questions, and tomorrow we're going to look at fuel systems and electrical systems. Today's episode is called Low Speed ? But first, a correction. We showed a picture yesterday of CCTV camera on top of a street light on the airport perimeter. My apologies. We now believe the CCTV camera is 21 metres further away, down an alleyway where there is no Google Street View. The camera is on a dedicated pole at 23.080823 north, 72.640735 east. Many thanks to Ventus 45 for pointing this out. Here is a picture of another security camera as seen from the security CCTV camera we are using. Viewers' comments and questions. Paul Stedmon, OW1EP. Hi, I may be repeating what has already been discussed. I've flown 747 and 767, now retired. I would like to point out a grey area in takeoff performance. The rate of acceleration to V1 is not calculated in seconds for all takeoff, so the V1 position on the runway is assumed. An experienced pilot would know roughly at what point to expect V1. For a 747 at max takeoff weight, V1 is 45 seconds from power applied. Rotate is close to the threshold of the reciprocal runway, total runway time 60 seconds approx. I could be wrong, but if there was a gradual reduction in power on the takeoff roll, it may have been missed. It looks like the power reduced. V1 was late, if ever achieved, and pilot was committed to rotate as he had no choice. Just a thought, and that's a good thought. Richard.
Yeah, interesting, Paul, and thank you for that. Takeoff performance is the subject of many books. Also, of course, all of the manufacturers' training and operating manuals. And there are regulatory handbooks as well. As my understanding, and you can correct me, Paul, the standard operating procedure is for the pilot flying to call out 80 knots and the pilot monitoring to check and confirm, and he will say check. The pilot monitoring calls out V1, the speed where the aircraft is committed to takeoff, where you can no longer abort and brake in time. At some point, you will be running out of runway, of course. And then there's V rotate, and then positive rate, confirming the initial climb, and then normally gears up, and then V2, which has to be maintained during the initial climb out. In military aviation, especially in the Cold War and the early jet era, it was common practice, particularly on bomber and large transport aircraft, for the pilot monitoring or the flight engineer to call out runway distance markers during takeoff and compare them with a stopwatch. This was used to verify acceleration performance and ensure the aircraft was within the expected parameters for a safe takeoff. In the Air India case, I think they had a problem around V1, but they were then committed to takeoff. And we're still working on our analysis of the runway speed during the rollout. We're going through the video frame by frame, and that will take some time. It appears that they eventually achieved V1 around 151 knots, and then V rotate around 166 knots, and then V liftoff at around 171 knots, but they did not achieve V2 at around 177 knots. So we'll come back on that study when we've got more details.
Joey Blogs 007. The sole survivor is not the sole eyewitness. Obviously, there were other eyewitnesses on the ground. That said, the sole survivor's account is a critical piece of information, i.e., engine thrust increasing to go up. The question is, at what point in time and flight did he observe that? That is the critical aspect of his observation. Obviously, thrust would seem to be increasing initially at takeoff. Then a standstill in the air feeling described by the sole survivor of the flight would have likely been the moment of our aerodynamic stall of the aircraft.
Yeah, good insight, Joey Blogs. Thank you for that. And I have only seen the one eyewitness set of reports from the sole survivor. I've only seen one video of the takeoff from the airport security CCTV and one other video of the short flight by a young guy called Farouk. If there are other eyewitness reports and other videos from different angles of the actual flight and not made up ones from artificial intelligence sources, then please share them with us. The email address, you can't put links from everywhere except YouTube in YouTube, but you can send us a link via email.
Okay, Unzad Non. One thing is known, they are taking far too long to release the CVR and black box data. They, Boeing Air India, know exactly what happened. They are stalling to allow time to concoct their own narrative. Statistically, accidents as a result of pilot error are declared very soon after the accident.
Yeah, well, we still don't know the cause, and if it's known to Boeing, and if it's known to Air India, and if it's known to the investigators and authorities, then we can only plead with the authorities to give us an update. We're not expecting a final conclusion, but it would be nice to have some form of update on what they're working on and what they know and have established so far.
Matthew Vaughn, 4526. Gents, as the cliche goes, long time listener, first time caller. From your work so far on this tragic event, what are the human factors investigators might take into account during this investigation? Keep up this important yet tasteful work on honouring those who lost their lives in the future prevention of others.
Yeah, well, there's probably quite a list, Matthew, that the investigators will be looking at in terms of human factors. So they'll be looking through the training records, the maintenance records, they'll be looking at the ground handling procedures, they'll be looking even at the catering suppliers and the baggage handlers and the cargo loading. They'll be looking at, of course, the pilots in detail and their training record, and they'll be considering any pilot error or the information that's supplied by the dispatchers and whether that was correctly recorded in the aircraft systems. So, yeah, many thanks for your comment, and there are quite a few angles that will be investigated.
Mike Zulu 8709. In the US, coverage of this crash has disappeared from mainstream news coverage. Not even a mention since the day after it happened. It reeks of a Boeing is too big to fail mentality. Say what you want about the Indian government, but Indian reporters are talking about this every day. This isn't some old Soviet airliner that crashed. It's supposed to be one of the most advanced aircraft in existence. The whole world depends on the 787, but the Western world doesn't seem to care that one just fell out of the sky. the Puff Daddy trial is more important. Hmm.
Yeah, well, I think Jeffrey, you've got a insight on this particular point from Mike.
Yes, look, Mike, to me, um, it reeks of the US media, in fact, being consumed by other matters. The Israel Iran spat, and of course, the President Donald Trump, and some of the things that are going on there. Also, tragically, and this I've been covering aviation for too long, this didn't happen in the US, and there are, I don't think, any Americans on board this aircraft. Now, a good example of this, you go back in history to Pan Am 103. It crashed on the 21st of December 1988 at Lockerbie, killing 270 because of a bomb. It received massive coverage all across the globe. But 1 year later, a UTA Flight 772, a McDonnell Douglas DC 10, was blown up over Niger a year later, as I said, killing 170. The passengers were mainly French, Congolese, and from Chad. That crash, that bomb, same as Lockerbie, barely got a mention in the United States or in the United Kingdom. It crashed in a very remote location. You couldn't get media to it. And so the coverage was totally the opposite. And that's what happens with air crashes. It depends on who's on board, it depends on whether the media can get to it. There's all sorts of factors that go into this. I think it's far too early to say that it reeks of Boeing is too big to fail. What are your thoughts, Richard?
Yeah, I think we see the same thing with MH370.
Mm,
There were, of course, a large number of Chinese and a large number of Malaysian. So it gets big press coverage in China and Malaysia. There were several Australian families, so there's a interest in Australia. There was one French family, and so the French press are in there. But for example, in Germany, very little press coverage by comparison, and of course there were no German nationals on board. So,
mm.
it varies from country to country and from accident to accident.
And just going on from that, if I can add a little another dynamic, when I was covering MH370, the newspaper that I was writing for wasn't that interested in the technicalities of it all. They wanted to get the human interest story. In other words, the people story, the Australian families. And it's the same with MH17. Same thing again. The technicalities didn't matter nearly as much as the human interest story. So that goes to underscore whether your nationals are on board, whether it's relevant or not. So interesting. Michael BA181, looking forward to the next episode about fuel and electricity. Please talk about BPCU, what it does when there are electrical failures and how suction feed works when all fuel pumps fail, possibly insufficient suction feed during climb led to thrust not achieved.
Michael, you'll be pleased to know here's a sneak preview of tomorrow's episode. And of course, you're not talking about the brake power control unit, the BPCU, or did you want us to cover the brakes as well? Um, I guess you mean the bus power control unit, known as the BPC, without the U. Only kidding. Anyway, here's a sneak preview. Suction feed is controlled by the engine-driven fuel pump, EDFB, if the fuel booster pump fails. And the EDFP provides mechanical suction to pull fuel from the tanks to the engine. It can sustain fuel delivery without boost pump pressure, provided there is no vapor lock or blockage.
Mm. AWE bus driver. I'm not certain how OAT temperature is entered into the FMC, but if the entry was incorrect, lower temperature, that would affect the thrust the FADAC would command for takeoff. Assume that the temperature was set at 4 degrees instead of 43 degrees, the FADAC would command a much lower thrust than necessary for flight. When entering 43C but failing to verify could result in 4C being entered. Just because you press the button doesn't mean you made the correct entry unless verified. Just a thought.
Well, thank you for the thought, but the outside air temperature, OAT, is measured using a dedicated temperature sensor installed on the exterior of the aircraft fuselage, typically in an area which is minimally affected by engine heat or skin friction on the fuselage skin. The raw measurement is called total air temperature, TAT. And from that, the static air temperature, SAT, is calculated. And that's what we call the OAT, the outside air temperature. What is entered manually is the takeoff weight of the aircraft, which will affect the thrust even more. There is a study by the ATSB in Australia of 31 incidents over a 20-year period where the incorrect takeoff weight caused incidents. And I quote from that report, a review of the international and Australian occurrences show that these type of errors have different origins. With crew actions involving the wrong figure being used, data entered incorrectly, data not being updated, and data being excluded. And furthermore, a range of systems and devices are involved in these errors, including performance documentation, laptop computers, the flight management computer, the aircraft communication addressing and reporting systems. The consequences of these errors has ranged from a noticeable reduction in the aircraft's performance during takeoff through to aircraft being destroyed and loss of life. So it's a huge span. And they go on in their report to say that 39% of the factors that they identified related to crew actions, including monitoring and checking and assessing and planning. And there were 31% inadequate risk controls, mostly centered around poor procedures, and 27% were due to uh, crew management practices and training which were inadequate. And it's a fascinating report to read. And we can include a link to that in the ATSB website, and you can download it if you wish.
Default user ID 1559. I'm also new to the channel because of all the misinformation about the Air India crash. On some of the other channels covering this, you hear discussion about causes that were put to bed days ago. On this show, India-based coverage seems to be sensationalistic and eager to point the fingers and assign the blame, so I don't bother to watch them. Keep up the great work, gentlemen. And Ming Blues. This discussion, including remarks of others, is invaluable. Thanks to all positive contributors.
Two very interesting and kind comments. Thank you for that. And yeah, sometimes the press will just be sensationalist, and we're trying uh, hard to avoid sensationalism. We will not show pictures that we have because they are just purely sensational. And we do try to avoid speculation. I know many people have accused us of speculation, but There is a difference between developing a hypothesis which is testable and conjecture which might help to lead to a hypothesis. And we very clearly state when we're theorizing or when we believe we're stating facts and data. So it, we can always make mistakes, and we do, but we're trying hard to avoid those mistakes.
Manny Oro, as a private pilot and electrical engineer, I'm very interested in what caused this accident. By now, you guys are pretty much the only source of information I listen to due to the high level of technical information and respect for the victims. I once lost an engine on takeoff at 800 feet AGL while on upwind. I remember a few things that went through my mind all at once. I was in disbelief and considered continuing to fly. I went back to my basics and focused only on landing safely above all else. I had enough time to call for a mayday and warned incoming traffic to get out of the way. My mind was all over the place for a few seconds, but I was still in disbelief. Question: what are your thoughts on these two Air India pilots having much less time than I had on a much larger airplane with nowhere to land and the possible mistakes that could have made out of sheer panic? Could they have contributed to this tragedy by facing the horrible scenario in front of them? I know the feeling of sheer panic and what the brain can do in this state. Fortunately for me, I made it out okay. My thoughts are with those all lost souls. Very
Uh,
interesting comment.
very, very interesting, Manny, and thank you for that. There was so much going on and very little time to react. I think the pilots were juggling with many issues, and they were juggling those on a knife edge, and it could go one way or the other at any point. So I think they were exceedingly focused. Obviously, they're highly trained to remain focused and follow. If you don't get out the standard operating procedure, you go from memory in the key procedures. You have to memorize the key procedures that you follow. And we do know that they aviated. We do know they navigated, and we do know they communicated. So they followed the golden rules.
Mm.
And it'll be, fascinating as we get more evidence from the FDR and the CVR to find out exactly everything that they were trying to do to save the aircraft.
Yeah. Toby's stent. Richard, I think you are confused with the gear. The rear set of wheels are sitting lower, or as a commentator said, heel down, when the gear is fully extended. The clip you showed seems to show the gear with toe up, or the front set of wheels sitting lower, although it is hard to see.
Yeah, well, it wouldn't be the first time, Toby, that I've been confused. Um, Let me put it back to you. What is your conclusion from the screenshot we provided? Has the landing gear retraction process commenced or not? In my view, the screenshot shows toe down and not heel down. So, but I'm open to your further correction.
Melvin Darcombe, 7352. Aside from the aircraft incident, I would like the panel's view regarding the sole survivor and how he managed to escape the crash virtually unscathed. Well, I'm going to answer that one. Uh, he was sitting beside an exit, and if the impact cracked open the fuselage at that particular point, that would have helped also. But also the door probably on impact burst open and he is out. So he was sitting on an exit row by the window, by the actual exit, and that would have aided his escape dramatically. Um, so he was incredibly lucky. Um,
He, he was indeed incredibly lucky.
he was. Shashank Jandakar, I must tell you that it is only foreign media now that is taking efforts to understand the cause of the accident. Otherwise, Indian media has already forgotten or probably has been told to keep sealed lips. That's an interesting contrast to the other gentleman talking about US media.
Yeah, well, you won't be surprised that we follow the global media, including reports from Indian media and from US media and several other media in different countries. And I see regular reports from the US and from India and from many other countries. And I think there's a huge public interest in this accident because the first major fatality accident with a Boeing 787, and so many over 10 million of us get on a plane every day. So a huge public interest in this.
Mm. From Mark, hello Jeff. I'm not a pilot but an engineer. The profusion of software to drive systems with built-in protection to avoid mishaps is worrying me as they become ever more complex. The more lines of coding, in my view, the more potential for error. This can lead to a false sense of security. It wouldn't surprise me if it is found that conflicting signals may have confused the software and send the logic down a path to minimize thrust. Have there been any similar issues like this on other planes? Regards, Mark. There have.
Yeah, there have indeed. And we have reported at length on the Qantas 72 incident. We've reported the Anna 985 incident. There was a China Airlines 006 and a Turkish Airlines 1951 incident, which are further examples of an uncommanded input to the flight controls. We have done a whole episode on the Air France 447 where the autopilot just suddenly disengaged due to icing on the pitot tubes, which caught the pilots by surprise. So, any of these surprise, uncommanded changes to the flight and the flight controls and the attitude of the aircraft or the thrust available. There are a number of examples, and when you're taken by surprise, I mean, you have to then react very quickly. And when you're in the situation like Air India, and you're just at a very low altitude, barely a couple of hundred feet off the ground, maybe 300 or 400 at the most, and at a very low airspeed, you don't have the altitude and the airspeed to deal with the emergency.
Yeah, indeed. Yet, however, overall, air safety rates have increased dramatically because of computerization. And we've covered that in a previous episode as well, Richard.
Yeah, we have indeed gone through in detail how software's developed and tested, and there's a lot going on behind the scenes.
Sure is. So, viewers, thank you very much indeed for watching. That's all we have time for today. Tomorrow, as we had mentioned, we're going to be looking at fuel systems and electrical systems on the Boeing 787 and what impacts they might have had on this tragic loss of 171. Richard, thank you very much indeed for your work on this today. And viewers, thank you for tuning in. Please subscribe to us. Please like us. Please keep the comments coming. And please do keep the questions coming. They're absolutely fantastic. So thank you, Richard.
Yeah, you're welcome. And thank you, viewers, for keeping us on our toes.
Absolutely. And please tune in tomorrow. Take care.